Thank you.
It's great.
Morning, and let's start. And so this is the third seminar, cybersecurity seminar, and we have George Amariucai, and Professor George Amariucai is adjunct associate professor in the department, and he's been working here for 6 years. Seven now. Yeah, 7 years. And then George has been very successful in research and has the PI and co-PI for 3 NSF grants, and also he's a PI for NSC project. And so he's been focusing on the wireless security and also crypto and also humanized cybersecurity, working with some of us. And so without further ado, I'd like to ask George to start his talk on his research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. This talk is about how you can achieve security in infrastructureless environments. And why are we even looking at that? Jeez. I'm not sure how I can make this full screen. I guess I'll So, you see that current trends in communications involve more and more wireless devices. Some of them are very lightweight, talking wireless sensors and even RFID tags, which are purely passive, very low computational capacity. But there are more and more, and there will only be more. And at the same time, you see the wireless resource becomes more crowded. Devices have to all share the available spectrum. On the other hand, you see a rise in this paradigm, which is the sharing economy. And I mean, you can think of Uber, you're sharing your car, right? Airbnb, people share their home. And in communications, similarly, we're talking about spectrum sharing. You have cognitive radios. In fact, I was reading a paper in ECpE Spectrum the other day, and they were talking about wireless cell phone carriers. I think Verizon was one of them. They were trying to push this idea where they could hop under certain scenarios, they could hop into the Wi-Fi spectrum if their spectrum was too crowded. So kind of cognitive radios, right? They would sense for open spectrum, they would hop in it. Obviously this ruffles some feathers because there's a traditional open spectrum. You also see people sharing their devices for various purposes. One of them is ad hoc connectivity, so I could share my device to help other people communicate by routing their information, so forth. So we have wireless and the sharing economy. At the time we share, it's often there are security challenges. And one of the main security challenges, the way I see it in this sharing economy, is that traditional security relies on a public key infrastructure. So the public key infrastructure, I'm just going to mention it for those of you who are not very familiar with how it works. You rely on a certificate authority, which you subscribe to it, and it issues you a certificate which binds your identity to a public key. And you also have a private key associated to that public key. So if I want to establish secure communication with someone, I would just send them my certificate, they would send me their certificate. And with the two certificates using the public keys, we have guarantees that the public key belongs to the person I want to talk with, and we can establish a secret key using those public keys. But it's very complex because usually the key established is a root key. From that root key, you derive several other keys One of them is the session key, which you use currently for communicating information. Right? It's like at the lowest level of the key. But it has an expiration date, yes.
We have to check whether there's a screen here.
If the screen can. What do I do? Screen, share screen. Yes. Right. Does it work? Yes. Okay. So, what was I saying? The
Routines.
Oh yeah. The root key, right? So from the root key, you come up with some session key, and that expires several hours. Actually, the NIST recommends that you update that every several hours. And then, if you update it, how would you update it? Well, it's impractical to go through the whole process again. So you would produce another secret. You need some randomness, obviously, to produce a new secret key. And you can transmit that, but you cannot encrypt it with the old key. But rather, you have to encrypt it with a special key, which is called a key wrapping key. It's also derived from that root key. And of course, the key wrapping key also expires, and you have to renew it, probably through a key wrapping key, and so forth. So, there's some disadvantages, but in the sharing economy, we have lightweight devices. This might be an issue. First of all, some of the lightweight devices might not support the complexities of the public infrastructure. Some people may fear that the certificate authorities are subject to being controlled by governments, in which case you don't really want to use them because there's no more security guarantee there. And there are always, of course, compatibility issues. I can support some certificate, I trust some certificate authorities, trust others, we just don't meet in the middle. So what can we do about that? So the question is, can we establish keys between devices without using this public infrastructure? Several efforts have been made. I'm going to talk briefly about some of them. Some of them are actually quite interesting. So it started a while back with this physical layer secrecy. The idea is you have Alice, and I'm going to use this, if you're in security, you probably used this denomination of Alice Bob being the legitimate transmitter and receiver, and Eve, who's the evil eavesdropper. So imagine that Alice and Bob have a communication channel that's very good, and then Eve's channel from Alice to Eve is worse. And there are specific definitions, but I'm not going to get into what worse means. And then it's been shown that it's possible for Alice to transmit something perfectly secret to Bob, only using some sort of fancy channel coding on those nerves. And that channel coding involves some binning. So it's a bit tricky, but it's possible to transmit something without any encryption, essentially, just using this. Moreover, the security guarantee that this scheme offers is much stronger in its information theoretic security, rather than the computation. So it's security with respect to an unbounded adversary. It doesn't matter what capacities the adversary has, how large computational capacities it has. You will never be able to break the secret. While the traditional public infrastructure basically is based on computational assumptions, namely the adversary is bounded. It cannot perform any amount of computation at a given time. So you can see that this is somewhat stronger security definition. And then you have common randomness. The concept of common randomness is actually deriving from physical layer secrecy, historically speaking. The idea is Alice and Bob share some sequences. Well, not share. Each one of them has a sequence. You think of it as a sequence of bits. The two sequences are strongly correlated. The eavesdropper can also have a sequence that's correlated with these two. But then, using some public communication, Alice and Bob can establish a secret based on those correlated sequences, and that's called common randomness. Random sequences, common because they're correlated. And people used channel coefficients to produce this common randomness. For example, you can have Alice transmit something to Bob, Bob transmit something back right away. If this transmission between the two is very short, namely the time is less than what's called the coherence time of the channel, time during which the communication channel stays roughly constant. Then the channel has this property that is reciprocal, right? So reciprocity means Alice to Eve, the channel coefficient is roughly the same as Alice, so roughly the same as Bob to Alice. So they have these correlated sequences, which are essentially the channel coefficients. Similar common randomness was extracted from shaking devices. You take two phones, you shake them, the accelerometer readings will be these sequences that are correlated. Right? Another those paper that actually Jung brought to my attention. At some point, you can take two fingers like this and draw on two devices, just do some stuff on two devices screens. If you do that, the doodlings will be very correlated, right? Because you keep your fingers aligned. So, but the challenges I'm concerned with are, can we do the same? Can we establish common randomness in the absence of a direct link, so if the devices don't see each other, or if they're together without involving humans? So in the previous examples, when a person was shaking the devices had to be notified that they're going to be shaken, and that they're going to use that to establish a secret key. But if I'm notifying the device, I have to somehow authenticate myself to the device, because otherwise anyone can trick the device into establishing a secret key with any device. So the security of that key that's been established is essentially subject to the security of the authentication algorithm. Whenever you have security generated based on user input, you have to authenticate that user, and if that authentication mechanism is flawed, then the secret key you've established is pretty much useless. And so we'd like to do this automatically without human interaction. Right? And so in this talk, I'll talk about three things. I'll talk about an algorithm to establish this common randomness using just network metadata. This is a joint work with Mohammed Reza, this right here. Well, it's mostly his efforts, right? So some of my guidance. And then I'm going to talk about the time-based establishment algorithm, which is a joint work with Jung. And finally, I'm going to talk about how you can use community as another way of leveraging some advantage towards achieving some sort of security. So these are all very non-traditional forms of security, if you think about it. I thought it would be interesting to talk about them. So the first, establishing a key from network randomness. Again, we have multiple parties. We'd like to establish some sort of security between two parties using the randomness inherent in a network. And I'm going to go a little bit more. I already told you briefly about common randomness. I'm going to go a bit more into detail. So Alice, Bob, and Eve, all of them have access to some random variables. Let's call them X, Y, and Z. And there's a joint probability distribution, PXYZ, which is different than the product of margins, meaning that the three variables are actually correlated. And roughly, this is rough, but the desirable feature would be this one. I'm expressing it in terms of Shannon entropy because it's easy to understand and follow through, but it's a rough expression of the desirable feature. Anyway, that the entropy of X conditioned on the entropy of Z, which is what the user has, is larger than h of X given Y is Bob and Eve. Essentially, what this says is this piece right here that Alice and Bob share, but about which Eve has no information. That has to be non-zero, right? So if you have some non-zero part here, technically you should be able to establish a secret between Alice and Bob with public communication. So there are three phases to this mechanism. The first is the advantage distillation. Usually Alice and Bob have some sequences which don't necessarily follow that property, but they are able to exchange public messages to come up with some. So they start off with X and Y, and they come up with X, with X prime and Y prime, and they come up with X and Y, such that this property holds, right? This is the first step. The second is information reconciliation. So obviously, if Alice and Bob need to come up with the same thing, the same key, they have to come up with the same message first, right? With the same sequence. So they exchange public information to reconcile the two sequences, which might be initially a bit different. And this has a lot to do with channel coding and decoding. So the techniques used here are very similar to channel decoding, in fact. And then you have privacy amplification. So now Alice and Bob have identical sequences, but due to the fact that Eve had some Z, which is correlated to the initial sequences, and also due to the fact that they exchange some public information, now Eve already has some information about that sequence that they share. So you want to produce a key, which means it's a sequence that's random, uniformly distributed over its space. From Eve's perspective, in other words, that Eve has no idea, no information. You know, she cannot single out, she cannot get a biased probability distribution over the space of the keys, given her information. But that's exactly what this said. It says that the uncertainty, or the answer to the uncertainty about the established key, given Z's information, the information in Z, so Eve's information, is roughly equal to the unconditional entropy of the key, which means that Eve's information is useless, pretty much. So the question is now, how many bits can be achieved? And the traditional way to treat this, which was introduced by Alsford and Caesar in 1950, is that X, Y, and Z can be sampled a lot of times. And moreover, they have to be sampled in IAP fashion, so identically distributed and independent, which is rarely the case in practice. But if you do that, turns out, as n goes to infinity, the secret key rate is this Shannon mutual information between X and Y conditioned on Z. Now, again, there's several drawbacks here. First, the IID part, and second, the n goes to infinity part, which neither of those are usually the case in practice. So the question is, what if we don't have an infinite number of samples? And what if the information we have, X, Y, and Z, are not really IID? Because you don't really choose to sample, but usually you get some information which is usually processed, random process, that exhibits some correlation. And then in 2005, Brennan and Wolf give upper and lower bounds on this secret key rate. By the way, secret key rate means how many secret bits can be achieved for every bit of observed X, Y, and Z. So if I observe a sequence of 100 bits, X, Y is 100 bits, Z is 100 bits. If I can achieve 10 bits between X and Y, between Alice and Bob, then the secret key rate would be 0.1. And so these guys give bounds in terms of smooth gray entropies, in terms of max and min entropies, actually. But the problem is they're not constructive. They don't have a scheme for achieving the lower bound. Right? So don't know how to go about actually building that. Fortunately, in 2016, Hayashi, Tiagi, and Watanabe, they provide additional bounds, which this time are constructive. The lower bound is constructive. So they actually give a scheme how you go about achieving this secret. And this is the upper bound as epsilon delta, and I'm just explaining this a bit. So epsilon is the correctness. In other words, Alice and Eve both end this algorithm, this protocol with keys kx and ky, and they have to be the same, obviously. The probability that they're the same is larger than 1 minus epsilon. So with probability epsilon, it's accepted. If epsilon is very small, we accept that the protocol will fail with probability epsilon. And then delta is this security, as a quantify the security. This says that the joint probability of the key given the public information and whatever Eve had in the beginning is equal, is roughly, it's close to this product, which is a uniform probability distribution times P of Z, which means that the key is pretty much close to uniform and independent of everything Eve has. So that's the security. And this is usually statistical distance between the two probability distributions. Right, so that's epsilon delta. In the upper bound, just to get an idea of what we're dealing with, this beta is a probability of type 2 in a binary decision for the best test for a binary decision problem between two probability distributions. In other words, you look at X, Y, and Z, all the data that was obtained, and you want to decide whether it came from this probability, which is the true joint probability between X, Y, Z, and this product of margin, or like the probability of this type, essentially. And the probability of error of type 2 when the probability of the error of type 1 is less than epsilon. So that's what that beta means. And this is, it's a bit counterintuitive, but this is actually a lower bound, an achievable lower bound on the security rate. We're dealing with information densities. Information density is like, it's a random variable. So if you think of Shannon's information, mutual information, the Shannon mutual information between X and Y would be the average of this density, I, X, Y, with respect to the joint probability distribution of X and Y. So we're looking basically at the random variable, which is this difference of information densities. We're trying to evaluate the probability under its tail. Right? Both of these turn out to be hard when X, Y, and Z are, like in our case, produced by a model which is very much resembling a hidden Markov model. So they're hard to calculate. But anyway, and then we have a first paper that shows, it's a proof of concept that shows that you can actually achieve secrecy between parties using just stuff that you collect from the network, right? Randomness that you harvest from the network. So this is the algorithm Kerman. And it has some limitations, but they're quite, I mean, in practice, they kind of make sense. The idea is we're assuming that in a network, we have an ad hoc network. It's based on DSR, which is one of the two main algorithms for routing in ad hoc networks. The other one would be AOD. So we have an ad hoc network. Everyone moves randomly at a given speed in this network. And everyone collects information. And at some point, Alice and Bob decide, well, we have enough information together, and we can establish a secret key now, and we'll see what security guarantees they get. So Alice and Bob will show that they perform some sort of suboptimal information investigation. Again, this is just proof of concept. We're not interested in the actual implementation details, so we give an upper and a lower bound for what is achievable. Any implementation should be between those. And then Alice and Bob will be based their randomness, their common randomness on these routes that they've been active in helping with. So this is how the DSR works roughly. Let's say node 1 wants to communicate to node 6. Node 1 sends a packet, which is called the root request packet. And this packet is propagated through the network in a broadcast fashion. Number 2 gets it. Node 2 will insert its own ID in the packet, in the header, and will broadcast it further. Number 3 gets it, inserts its own ID, broadcasts it further. Finally, the request reaches node 5. Turns out node 5 already knows they're off node 6. So it sends back a packet, which is called the root reply, which says you should use route 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for achieving this, establishing this communication. It's also possible that another. By the way, each root request packet has an ID of its own, so you can make, if you have made a root request, it's unsuccessful, you increase that ID, you make another root request. So for the same root request, node 5 could get the second packet from node 7, which node 5 will just discard because it sees it refers to the same root request, it's already served that. So that's pretty much how it works. And now the question is if we're going to use this route. So we're going to use the fact that we had a route 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at some point. Okay? So if we're going to use this to establish a secret key, then actually the question is now, okay, so who knows that route? Who's privy to that information? It's obvious that nodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, very likely 6, also because he is going to be part of the application, are privy to that route, right? So they already know that route. So if any one of these is a potential eavesdropper, you have to watch out. But who else? Well, there could be node 9 over here. For example, node 9 is close to 1, and it observed the root request, it observes the root reply, so it pretty much has that information. Okay? It's within eavesdropping distance of 1. So if you put, the worst case scenario is when you put all these nodes, take a route of length L, you put all these nodes in a line, and you look at the space around them. So this area, pretty much overlapping circles, that's the eavesdropping area, okay? If any node is in that area, at the time when the request and the transmitting, subsequent communications taking place, then those nodes in that area must have overheard the routes. So now, because all the nodes move randomly in the network, we're using this to say, well, the probability that the node that's not part of the route overheard the route is equal to the probability that it happened to be within this area at that time. And what's that probability? Well, you just divide this area by the whole area of the network. Right? So we're kind of making the assumption that every node is in a specific area of the network with a probability equal to that area divided by the whole area of the network. And then the nodes will maintain tables of the routes that they are part of. They have to have an identifier which contains the source, the destination, the number of the root request. Remember, each root request has a serial number. And the guy who initiated the root reply, which in most cases might be the destination, but in our case, it could be that it's not destination. Our example is not 5. And then this is the full route. The partial route is those nodes of the route which we are certain that have this information. We're not that certain about node 6 because node 6 never received the root request. It doesn't have this identifier. So we're only going to be able to establish secrets between pairs of these within this set. Right? But the full route is going to be the basis for that secret. And then we have a proposition which says if two nodes have the same entry, the same RID, same identifier in the table, then the full routes responding to that are exactly the same. And now for the information reconciliation, we just say Alice will send, we're looking at her table. Alice wants to establish a secret with Bob. We're looking at that table. We'll see that she has 100 routes in common with Bob. So 100 routes for which the partial route contains Bob's ID. And it transmits the identifiers of those routes, the RIDs, to Bob. And she can do that in several ways, right? Obviously, the problem here is if you transmit an RID, the identifier, let's look again at this previous slide. So if you transmit an RID, you see that some information leaks to a potential eavesdropper. If an eavesdropper listens, she sees, okay, Alice and Bob want to communicate the message. She knows this already. And then she observes an RID, right? And that RID can leak information about the route. Who else is in the route? For example, if Alice is number 1, Bob is number 6, let's say, or Bob is number 4, Bob is number 4. When you send the RID, you see that the route also contains 5 and 6 that leaks information, right? So if you transmit the RID in the clear, you're always subject to this information leakage. But you can also transmit the RID perfectly protected. Well, you can't, really. we assume that it could essentially employ some sort of hashing to minimize the information loss, but there are problems with hashing overlapping, so we didn't want to get into the details, therefore we only give the lower bound, transmit everything in the clear, and the upper bound, everything is perfectly secret. Transmit the RID is perfectly secret, obviously no information will be from them. Now if you transmit them in the clear, depending on the RID, you'll have several groups. For example, if an RID looks like this, where the source and destination is Alice and Bob, the eavesdropper doesn't get much information. Essentially, she might only get the root reply sender, okay, which is a new node. Because she already knows that Alice and Bob are going to be there. But if the RID is like this one, where neither source nor destination nor the root reply sender are Alice or Bob, then three more nodes will lead to the eavesdropper. So depending on the route length, that actually might make the route useless for this purpose of establishing secret keys. And then the privacy amplification stage, there are standard techniques in cryptography about extracting randomness. It turns out that the bounds for randomness extraction, how many bits you can extract, are pretty much roughly equal to the smooth minimum entropy. By the way, there's an error here. So I'll tell you what in the definition of smooth entropy. So the minimum entropy is the logarithm of the maximum of P of x. Okay, so you have a probability distribution over space, P of x. You take the largest value in that probability distribution. In other words, the one corresponding to the most likely outcome. And you take log or minus log of that, and that's your minimum entropy. And it has a very intuitive interpretation if you think of information extraction. Now, the smooth minimum entropy is you don't consider the original probability distribution, but rather you consider a probability distribution that's close to it. Okay? So, in other words, you say, well, with probability epsilon, the algorithm will fail. But with probability larger than 1 minus epsilon, it's as if we have this new probability distribution which features a larger minimum entropy, right? So you can increase the minimum entropy a little bit by smoothing it or by adjusting the original probability distribution a little bit, so you get more bits out of that. So that's pretty much the number of bits that you can get. So essentially we're interested in this smooth minimum entropy defined for the routes, right? The probability on the routes, establishing secret keys based on the routes. So we're interested in the probability distribution from Eve's perspective of the route. So it's interesting. What's interesting here is that even the fact that Eve observes an RID, okay? So she says, well, I don't know this. I don't have this. Even the fact that she doesn't know it leaks information to her. Why? Well, if you think about it, it's more likely that she doesn't know a short route than a long route. If you have a long route of length 20, then it's more likely that Eve overheard someone. But if you have a route of length 3, it's less likely, right? So even that fact that Eve does not know the route leaks information. That's why when we are talking about probability of route, condition on the fact that Eve doesn't know that route, and on the RID, which may or may not leak information. And so it depends. This is just some combinatorial results that we calculate this probability for different groups. One assumption that we make is that all the routes of the same length are equally likely. So that's why the probability of a route, length LR, is the probability of the length being LR divided by this. This is the number of possible routes length LR, when 3 of the nodes are known, Alice, Bob, and someone else. So this is under group 1. Similar for the other ones. And we go ahead and essentially apply the Bayes rule a couple of times and come up with the final probability distribution. One of the interesting things is this piece comes into play, the probability of LR equals to R, so the probability of the length, right? The probability distribution over the length. And that's very hard to actually come up with. It depends on a lot of the parameters of the network. So we chose to run the network a lot, run a long simulation and look and get an empirical probability distribution for this. Okay, so this probability of the length is empirical. And the upper bound is a bit easier to deal with. We don't have the groups, so we simply divide the probability of the length by the number of possible routes. Anyways, so now the question is, how do we deal with the fact that Eve might have overheard? So even though Eve is not part of the route, she might have overheard the route. There's no way of knowing it. So we cannot get rid of this. It would be really nice if we could get this event and incorporate it into that momentum and say, well, we always can extract this many bits. This is cause for the fact that Eve would have overheard. But we can't do that, okay? And in fact, I was able to do that for a very simple scenario where you have IID events and a Bernoulli distribution of them. But in general, you cannot. So we have to deal with this somehow. So what we do is we take out Alice and Bob from the equation. Alice and Bob are the two nodes, essentially. We put all the routes in a table. And in this matrix, right? And in this matrix, for example, if node 1 is part of the route, then A11 is equal to 1, because with probability 1, node 1 knows the route. If node 2 is not part of the route, then A12 is the probability that node 2 overheard the route, so it was nearby when the route was established and communications began. So that we get from that ratio of the areas, remember? So we do the ratio of the area around the route, worst case scenario divided by the total network, that gives us A12. And then the task is to group this route into submatrices so that for a submatrix, the column-wise products are all equal to some epsilon 1, and that's our security parameter. We say with probability larger than 1 minus epsilon 1, at least one of the route was not overheard by any of the nodes in the network, right? So we have at least one route that's secret. That's with probability larger than 1 minus epsilon. So we can proceed to group all the routes together and extract the information corresponding to, obviously, the crappiest route, basically, because you can't know which one, right? So the route that provides the fewer bits. So that's, and we have a couple of algorithms for that. One is a naive one is a more advanced heuristic algorithm. Anyway, but as a simulation, we did 100 meters by 100 meters, 50 nodes for 10 minutes, right? And these are the reception threshold is responsible for determining the eavesdropping distance, and we have packet interarrival model and speed. So that's what we get. We get a overall a lower bound of 862 secret bits achievable, an upper bound of about 5,000. This again just a proof of concept. And now we're starting to look into more complex structures. In essence, we're looking at graphs. So if you're walking through this network and you listen to what's going on, you will observe parts of the network. You can think of them as graphs, or graphs with some communication associated to them, right? But they're partial views of this network. So essentially, the network, which is evolving, it's a dynamic network, is essentially a Markov chain. And our observations, for example, the process X is a hidden Markov model, and similarly is Y, similarly is Z. So how can we deal with this? And we're looking at currently at the most general case where, okay, you have a hidden Markov model with some specifications. How do you calculate these bounds? It turns out they're hard to calculate because you have to sum over all the states if you want to apply this direct, right? In this case, X, Y, and Z would be a sequences, right? X would be a hidden Markov model, Y and Z would also be hidden Markov models. So they're random process, they're sequences. Even if you consider 200, a sequence of 200 symbols, if you want to sum, even if the state is binary, in order to compute these, you have to sum up to the power 200, to the power 200 summations. So that's very unpractical. And food has a string of papers, apparently, which are helpful in processing these. And food is actually a graduate file state from statistics a while back. So is in Taiwan now. So that's what we're working on. Pretty exciting, if you ask me. Now the second topic I want to talk about is this time-based security. So the idea here is you have devices that spend a lot of time in the company with each other, okay? And could they use that? Could they leverage that advantage to establish secrecy? Establish a secret key. Again, it has to be without human intervention, okay? So these devices kind of have to figure out that they're with each other. But they cannot use any pre-existing authentication mechanism because then everything would be subject to that. So how do you do it? Well, very straightforward idea is to have one device run a puzzle, okay, and spit out a clue for that puzzle every so often. And then the other device would collect clues, and after a while, it would be able to solve the puzzle, okay? So, applications of this would be, for example, RFID tag, right? RFID tags embedded in clothing, you take them home and put them in the closet, they stay in the closet for a while, they can communicate with a smart closet reader, which tells you how to dress and makes fashion recommendations and so forth. Personal devices, you take your laptop and your phone at home, they spend time together roughly in a secure environment. Military devices are stored overnight in secure locations and so forth. And again, the protocol should stand alone and should be automatic. There's very restrictive features, actually. So this is what we want. This is the ideal, okay? We want information about the puzzle to leak in this manner. In other words, if you are able to listen for a long, uninterrupted time interval, the longer the time interval, the more information you get, okay? So we want the information increased to be over linear. We usually talk about it in terms of exponential, but it doesn't have to be exponential, it could be polynomial, right? But we want it to increase like this. And similarly, if you stop listening, and again, this is wireless, right? So we expect clues to be missed just because of the random nature of the wireless environment. So if you miss several clues, it shouldn't be a big deal. You just lose a bit of information, you continue. Like here, right? If you lose a little bit, you continue. But if you miss a lot, you should be penalized quite a bit. So the more you're away from the device, the more penalty you should incur. So that's why we want the information to actually decrease as you keep, if you're not within range of the device. These are very unnatural processes. Usually in nature, you'd see process converge, very nice differential equations, right? So smooth, dying out exponentials. These are more characteristic of something like positive feedback. Have a system with positive feedback, will diverge like that, will explode. So we're looking at how do we introduce this phenomenon of positive feedback into the mechanism. We had a paper in 2011 with Jungwan and Cliff Berkman, which is currently the chair of the math department. And we played with the concept a little bit, and we provided a first order approximation to it. So this was targeted to RFID, it was published in an RFID symposium, and this is how it works. The reader will query the tag. It will have to prove legitimacy. If the tag recognizes the reader, it responds with the universal product code. Otherwise, it sends a clue to the reader. So the reader keeps collecting these clues. After a while, it is able to prove its legitimacy to the tag. And we implemented this very simply. This is a linear feedback shift register. The weights, these weights of the LFSR are unknown, are the secret. And if you listen for a long while to the LFSR, right? If the LFSR has R taps, if you listen for R, you get all the initial state of the LFSR. If you listen for R more taps, R more outputs, then you get R equations in R unknowns, which are the tap weights. So that's very straightforward to solve. And this is how it looks, the second figure, right? So you get no information for a while, and then information starts leaking linearly. So it's like a first order approximation, pretty much like you have the current voltage characteristic of a diode, and you make it. So this was actually a good, interesting story. Eddie Jules, apparently, was one of the organizers of the RFID conference, RFID Cybersecurity. He really liked this, and a month after the conference, he actually filed for a patent on a scheme that's a dumbed-down version of this. It's a bit simpler scheme, and I think he got the patent last year. So interesting. Anyway, so we want to go beyond this first order approximation. That's what we're working on now. We have a student working on algebraically solving this problem, but you'll see it gets more complex and it kind of seems similar to the other one. So some back of the envelope calculations. What do we want? We want, any time you start, it doesn't matter if you start at time 1 or at time 2 or time 3 or at time 500, you should start in the same manner. So information should start leaking to you at the same rate, right? And you should see the same progress. We also want superlinear leakage. In other words, if I already have clue 1, then the amount of information provided about the secret by clue 2 should be larger than the amount of information provided by the secret by clue 1 if I don't have anything. So this is what this inequality states, which, you know, if you combine these two together, you can come up with this inequality. So the mutual information between the secret and the clue 1 given clue 2 has to be larger mutual information between the secret and the clue 1 unconditional. Turns out there's a paper in 2002 by Renner and Moore, which says that this is only achievable if the conditional probability distribution of clue 2 given the secret and clue 1 cannot be written in this multiplicative form. But what are the implications of that? Well, if you think about it like this, the secret, evolving or not evolving, it doesn't matter, and the clues being split out at each time, there's clue 1, clue 2, clue 3. This is not a good approach, because in this case, you can trivially write this probability distribution multiplicative like this. In fact, this turns out to be 1, right? It's because this is a Markov chain. So this is what usually people think of when they talk about the hidden Markov model. There's a standard hidden Markov model. But in fact, the hidden Markov model, more general definition, is the latter one. And that's the case we have to study, actually, because in this case, you cannot write the probability distribution in multiplicative form. So we're looking at the general hidden Markov model. In fact, the definition of a hidden Markov model is that a process is a Markov chain when conditioned on the underlying Markov chain. Okay? This is a more general hidden Markov model. Again, we have a finite time to deal with it. So we're running into the same issues of quantifying the performance of this Markov chain and then seeing how the performance changes when we modify the transmission and emission matrices and also these links. So between the clues. So we're trying to modify those to achieve our ideal behavior. How am I doing on time?
8 minutes.
8 minutes, okay. So community-based security. This is again, one thing that you can leverage. So people have to have some sort of advantage in order to be able to establish security, secure communication or secure authentication, security. So one of the advantages could be that they're all part of the same community. And I'll just give you this just an example of how that can work. But what do we mean by community? Well, it could be anything. It could be social networks. You're part of a social network, right? You're privy to messages being exchanged, all sorts of cultures that other people are not aware of. You have real friends that you meet with, and your devices could, during the meetings, capture information that describe, that pretty much is specific to the place where you met. So there's another, right? You could have cultural communities where you share a culture with someone, knowledge, and beliefs that enable you to leverage those, right? So imagine that you go into the Amazon, you see a tribe, and they already have their own language and culture, and they can speak to themselves. Even if you would understand the language, they will be able to communicate because they share that culture, and you would have no idea what they're talking about. See? They'll communicate through metaphors, for example. Communities of devices, we could have communities of devices, the same manufacturers, same processors, same software. So our application, which is an NSA project, it's joined with Young Won and Daji Chow and Akhilesh Tyagi. Is about extensible authentication. So we're trying to, soldiers should use their phones for communicating, for getting access to services and data. And you don't want to leave the phones open because unsecured, because they could be captured and that the information would leak to others. But at the same time, you cannot ask for soldiers to enter their passwords all the time because, well, first of all, they wear gloves. And then second, they could be under fire and, stressed and you can't ask them, okay, if you want to call for help, enter your password. Which is a 20-letter password that they had to choose for a security reason. Right? So we'd like the phone to be aware that they're still with the proper use and not lock out. Okay? So how do we do this? We have several biometric modules. We look at how the soldier walks, how the soldier uses the phone, punches the screen, interacts with the screen, and if whenever the soldier uses the phone, we're tracking the face and we do some face recognition. Of course, one of the main issues we have is that this data is sparse. So sometimes the soldiers don't walk and don't use the phone. So you don't have any data, right? What do you do then? So the idea is to use the community. Soldiers are usually deployed in platoons. So the phones should see neighboring phones that they recognize and they trust, okay? And if a phone sees that it's surrounded by phones that it knows that belong to people in the same platoon, it's more confident that it's still in the ownership of the right user. But if it becomes isolated, like this guy on the right here, the phone could then panic and lock the user out. Not ideal, but when something goes bad, everything does. So this is pretty much how we do it. We fuse the data from the biometrics and from the community. We're actually able to pull data from the neighboring devices, like confidence levels or even raw data. And we fuse it using an inference engine, which is implemented as a Bayesian network, a dynamic Bayesian network. This is an example of an time instance of this Bayesian network. We have E, which is a catastrophic event. Then we have these are all hidden, right? The ones in the middle are observable. We have these specific error events, which can mean that the sensor is broken and that the data is subject to that error. And then we have observables like phase, gate, community, and interaction with the screen. And then we have to infer the bottom band variables, just whether the user is authentic or not. We have to establish some confidence level for that, and we can compare it to some threshold. It's above the threshold, leave the phone on. And so here I condensed everything. So this U shows up at the top. This is evolution over time. B1 is the biometrics. B is the biometrics, so it's all of these observables condensed into one variable. E is the sensor-wise event. EC is the catastrophic event. So this is how it looks over time. There's time links between these variables, describing the evolution, so that it degrades graciously rather than drop instantaneously when things start to change. And one interesting issue that we ran into is how to incorporate community data. And the question is, okay, let's say I want to pull confidence from other neighboring devices, okay? So this is augmented Bayesian networks with the user authenticity being, depending on the confidence of the other devices. So what happens here is we get a positive feedback loop, which is very undesirable. And this will run by itself and essentially take our confidence to levels that are essentially wrong. How does this happen? Well, let's assume that the confidence of this user increased momentarily for a little bit. This is copied here. This one increasing causes the confidence of this one to increase, which is copied over here on the right, and then similarly this one causes this one to increase further, this increase causes this one to increase further, and so forth. So it just goes out of control. Of course, there are probabilities we're talking about, so they will limit themselves either to one or to something else. But regardless, this is harmful to the evolution and to the inference. So how can we get rid of this? And we're currently working on how to deal with this. We're writing a paper on positive feedback in communicating Bayesian networks. How we're currently doing it, we're running two separate Bayesian networks. One of them deals with only the local data and runs inferences and produces confidence levels based on our local data, and that confidence level is the one that's communicated to other neighbors. In addition to that, we run a different Bayesian network which uses the confidence from the neighbors. Most of the calculations can be reused, so it's not that big of a deal. Right? So that's how we're currently doing it. But it depends on what type of data you want to share. For example, if you share the raw data, the biometrics, like here, sharing biometrics, and I can run then joint inference in each device, there's no positive feedback occurring there, so kind of solves the problem by itself. So this is some of the bibliography that I used, and this is the end of this presentation, and thank you for paying attention. I want to acknowledge my PhD students, Mohammed Reza, who's sitting here, and Nick Berry, who's a student from statistics.
Well, thank you.
So, for the community-based,
Yes.
seems like it's related to using users deal by a friend.
Yes.
Something. And maybe if I have a phone, I'm allowed to use my phone if some of my previously registered friends, their phones are used by. Something like this.
Yes, well, it's a joint decision, right? So the phone looks at everything it sees, including, yes, how many neighbors you have, right? But if it's pretty confident, let's say, it sees that you're walking properly, your face looked very good a minute ago, right? You entered the password 5 minutes ago. It kind of takes a joint decision based on all of this that it should probably leave it open. It's very likely that you're the right user, right? But then again, if something happens, regardless of whether it sees the neighbors, if you start walking strangely, it could, for example, cut you off. So
you will consider, for example, my phone. You will consider the behavior of data my phone collects, and also my friend's phone. But their phone collected.
Yes. Yeah, so all of this answers the equation, of course.
Yes, in this phone, their authentication are very correlated. Whether I am authenticated will impact whether my friends are authenticated.
That's right, that's right. We want that kind of communication, right? That's the basis for communication.
Right, so the man has some, for example, I have so many friends. Which friend I should select? Ideally, it's in your phone will previously have some registered phone that you will.
It does, right. In this specific application, right, we're operating with the premise that each phone knows already some phones, right? This is a platoon of soldiers. They know each other.
Yes.
They already sent
So
out.
some phones have to be previously registered.
Yes, yes. we're assuming that they have some sort of way of recognizing each other and communicating securely with each other, right? So.
Yeah, pretty much. I think then some question is which forms will you select?
Well, if you have all of them, you can select all of them. You know, the more native, unless of course you're running into computational problems. But so far, you know, the basic address is relatively simple, the one we have. So it's very fast. But should you have to deal with more complex, then you would indeed be in this problem, right? Face this problem. Which ones do you select?
Right, yes, because I asked this question because Facebook actually is using some authentication very similar. Basically, Facebook, for example, if I forget my password, I can reset my password using email signature, using a URL signature email. But for example, I registered my Facebook account using a work and that email expired.
Yes.
So I cannot use that method to reset the password.
That's right.
Facebook offers another choice is I can create right now. Okay, I haven't forgotten my password. I select several of my friends.
Yeah.
Okay, they are my trusted friends.
Okay.
So later I forget my password. Then Facebook, I will recover my password with the help of my those friends. It's basically network. Right?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, Facebook will figure out. I tell Facebook I want to reset my password using this method. Facebook will send some random numbers to those friends. Then I just call them, get those random numbers to their Facebook, and then Facebook allow me to reset the password.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the real answer is similar.
Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting application.
Right.
I was not aware of this, Rob. I don't have a Facebook account.
Right. Yeah, it's not. It's right. Your application is different. Meaning the real.
Any more questions? Okay, let's thank the judge again. Thank you. So we have another seminar from Ben Poland about malware analysis next Monday. Thank you. Should I stop? We just leave it there.
All right. So was that? Yeah, pretty much. The
first piece of work is to consider how we so this is an extreme case,
yes. Well, yeah, it doesn't compromise security, but yeah, it's like a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
But we can't know, right? All, but I think, well, we could. We have information and some, yeah, but it would be just extremely complex.